My name is Angus Buchanan. The London Business School asked me to give a brief presentation on the wider impact of sport beyond the adrenaline of competing and spectating. As an Arsenal fan, I know about the adrenaline of spectating. The subject pretty neatly maps my own journey and life spent in sport and major events. I spent my early career competing as an offshore yachtsman, mostly chasing a number of speed and distance records. We won the Jules Verne Trophy in 1994, which dates me for the fastest non-stop circumnavigation of the planet. And I went to the America's Cup with Team New Zealand in 1995. I thought that was the adrenaline chapter, and then I started running my own business. But it was an early inspiration for me to dedicate my life to high-performance sport. I subsequently qualified as a litigator and lawyer at city firm Herbert Smith, now Herbert Smith Freehills, before I left that to go and work with a number of major events, and then I set up the business in 2006 with a co-founding partner. We've since grown TSC to become one of the leading management consultancies and commercial advisories, working in international sport alongside the world's leading events, brands, and government clients, which I'll come back to. In fact, one of our specialisms is the relationship between sports major event, and government, where we work on strategy, bidding, and event optimization. You may have heard the panel earlier. I've had the privilege, and it really is a privilege, of working on many major mega events like the Olympic Games, FIFA World Cup, and a lot with Expo. We've worked with major federations like World Rugby, the ICC in cricket, and with some of the world's largest sports events. We did a lot of work with the NFL, with F1, and with Major League Baseball. Our work with government started here in the UK. I'm going to refer to that a little bit in due course, but we've extended that to work in European governments in Spain, Denmark, Belgium, and we also work quite extensively across Australasia. The client checkerboard. No agency can stand on a stage and not show it, so I thought I'd better put one up. And you can see a range of our international clients there. It's still the bulk of our business. About 70–80% of what we do is international. We now work extensively in the MENA region. We have an office in the UAE and one in Riyadh in Saudi. We've been working for a wide range of public and private sector clients since 2006, and you can see some of them there. In this short presentation, I want to touch on the wider impact of sport, and no one, in my opinion, has captured that better than Nelson Mandela. I was very privileged to be there when he said this at our client, Laureus World Sports Awards, back in 2000. And I want very briefly, in the next 30 minutes, to touch on sport's remarkable impact in almost every dimension of political, cultural, and economic, social realms. And I'll use some examples of international best practice we've seen from our work with the private sector and public sector over the 17 years of our business's existence. And then at the end of each theme, just in case you think it's not MENA related, I'm going to go international and then back to MENA. So I want to really look at the, frankly, quite astonishing progress the region has made in a very, very short period of time. It's a region, I think, where there's an enormous demand and need to excite a growing and very youthful population. And the sports sector, as you will have heard earlier, has been identified as a key driver of economic, social, and cultural policy objectives in the region. These will help MENA continue to challenge very outdated perceptions of the region and forge positive relationships with regional and international partners. Now, given where we're sitting, you're sitting, I'm standing, I thought it best to start with the London 2012 Olympic Games to examine in the broadest possible sense the impact the world's largest sport event can bring across the full spectrum of sport's transformative power. I'll read this quote because I like it. To make an Olympic champion, it takes 8 Olympic finalists. To make 8 Olympic finalists, it takes 80 Olympians. To make 80 Olympians, it takes 202 national champions. To make national champions, it takes thousands of athletes. To make athletes, it takes millions of children around the world to be inspired to choose sport. So began Sebastian Coe at the time, now Lord Sebastian Coe, when he was the head of the London 2012 Bid Committee, when he was reporting to Singapore IOC Selection Committee, July the 6th, 2005. This was the end of the beginning of London's successful bid for the London 2012 Games. I'm biased, but I think one of the best Olympic Games modern Olympic Games in recent history. London's bid success was far from easy, and it certainly wasn't even seen as likely. It came in the face of extremely challenging political brokerage that sowed the seeds of our company's foundation. My co-founding business partner was head of legal at the BOA at the time, working to secure that support. The bid came on the back of the ignominy of 3 failed previous bids in 92, 96, and 2000. It came on the back of the embarrassment of having to hand back the World Athletics Championships because we couldn't fund it. There was massive overspend on Wembley Stadium, and as a consequence, we came into that bidding cycle as huge underdogs to Paris. Brits like being underdogs, as it turns out. The Blair government at the time achieved something very unusual and very persuasive for the IOC in its decision-making. Total cross-party political support for everything, from the bid all the way through to the cost required to host the Olympic Games. And that is an extraordinary thing in this system. So extraordinary, I would challenge anyone in this room to think of a single other peacetime event that could achieve it. How? Why? Simply because the BOA and the bid committee, the politicians who supported the bid, believed in the premise of today's discussion. Not just that sport matters, or even that sport's important, but that sport has uniquely transformative powers unrivaled by almost anything else, and that London and the UK needed it at that moment. The London Olympic Games cost £8.8 billion, delivered urban transformation of East London, it delivered a generational shift in attitudes and behaviours in sports participation, an extra 1.7 million tourists, a tourism boost of 2.5 billion, lasting societal change in attitudes to volunteering and civic engagement, and £13.3 billion worth of economic impact, including over £6 billion of trade and FDI. To have those millions of children, in Lord Coe's quote, choosing to participate in sport, and having a system of facilities to support that requires very, very significant investment from government. For example, just in 2022, across the 27 member states of the EU government spend on recreational and sporting facilities accounted last year to €60.3 billion. That is a big number. That's 0.8% of general government expenditure. Up until 2021, in the GCC, you had invested in the GCC $65 billion worth of investment in the same measures. Again, very significant investment. What may surprise you is that government is, by some measure, the biggest investor in sport. In the first half of this decade alone, the largest 5 events in the world by visitor numbers and spectators, these events will, by our estimates, see government invest over $244 billion in combined capital and operational expenditure. Over the same period, in private sector income, this number here, from sponsors and broadcasters and everyone else, those same events earned $25 billion. I can do the maths, 10 times more. And to give you an idea, it's not just these big mega events. Until 2020, when broadcast revenues surged for Formula One, hosting revenues formed the largest form of revenue for Formula One, and that was only eclipsed from 2020. Host investment still makes up around 30% of what's invested in Formula One, and it's significantly more than the revenue Formula One takes from sponsorship. Bringing the example back to MENA. By 2010, the region had yet to host any of those recognised mega events. It wasn't alone. The white gaps on the map are those countries that had not hosted either the Olympic Games or the FIFA World Cup. And persuading large international federations like the IOC and FIFA to broaden beyond its historic US and Eurocentric focus was not a uniquely MENA challenge. Before the turn of the century, 86% of these events had been in either, well, Australasia, the Americas, and Europe. The rest had missed out. And it's surprising to me that it took so long for those, the IOC and for FIFA, to recognise the opportunities presented by 371 million people and a MENA GDP of over 5 trillion. Quite extraordinary. So perhaps a little less prosaic than Lord Coe, but certainly no less plaintive, Her Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Nasser of the Qatar Bid Committee asked a very simple question. When? When is the right time for the FIFA World Cup to come to the Middle East? The rest is history. And the results are remarkable, but no less remarkable, in my opinion, than the sheer audacity and vision and ambition and the quality of the infrastructure and the operational delivery of what is now regarded by many, and by many I mean 73% of fans who visited, and the Secretary General of FIFA, as the best World Cup final ever. We've worked with the Supreme Committee for a number of years, and most recently in relation to the FIFA World Cup impact assessment and the year anniversary summary, looking at the year-on benefits of hosting the FIFA World Cup. Admittedly, these are hard to read, so I apologise for the blizzard of numbers. The Qatar FIFA World Cup, we heard it on the panel, catalysed and brought forward, it's a misunderstood number. It was money that was going to be invested anyway, but was brought forward by the Qatari government on infrastructure of around 200 billion. And if you visited Qatar, you'll see it's created one of the most modern city-states in the world, and which I think the Qataris should be extremely proud, as well as 8 new state-of-the-art stadia. The event itself generated $16.3 billion of GVA, of which $14.7 billion was fan and visitor spend. And really interestingly, we did this report, I think, in November last year. So up until that point, in the first 10 months of 2023, 132% increase in visitation on an already elevated 2022. From a sustainability perspective, it was the first World Cup to achieve what's called ISO 2012-1 environmental standards, 0 domestic flights needed for players during the tournament. It had a heavily oversubscribed volunteer programme with 420,000 applications from around, I think it was 70 countries for 20,000 volunteering positions. It set new worker welfare standards, and 1 million underprivileged people from 75 countries benefited from the legacy programme Generation Amazing. It was an exceptional World Cup and exceptional for Qatar. Through our work on strategy, bidding and event optimisation, we've developed a 6-point methodology for measuring impact, the subject of today's discussion. I'm going to leave the top one, sporting considerations, to one side. It relates to the development of the systems to get those millions of children referred to earlier competing in sport. As regards sustainability, there's an obvious tension between hosting an event which moves 2.2 million people and sustainability. However, sport has a very important role to play in sustainability. Again, subject for another discussion. I want to maintain the focus on major events for the purposes of what we're talking about today. And in this context, economic impact requires to direct spend from visitation to a major event, organisational spend, jobs created before and after. Reputational is the media exposure and destination brand benefits of hosting an event like the FIFA World Cup. And societal, again mentioned on the panel earlier, to me the most important, we create a financial measure of the social return an event brings from greater civic engagement, driving participation, and the public health benefits that come from that. We've conducted one of the most extensive pieces of research in the host market, looking at the objectives of hosts and major events. We surveyed 100 government clients and many rights holders. Economic impact is still, today, the main driver when hosts are taking a decision whether or not to invest in an event. And before bringing this back to MENA, I just want to talk about golf. In the last decade, we worked with 2 Ryder Cup bids, and we consider it to deliver amongst the strongest economic impact per spend of any event. The Ryder Cup itself, with the USA-European context, transcends sport, and it has the broadest viewership amongst wider sports fans that goes way beyond the relatively narrow viewership of golf. For the host, golf events directly promote the destination's courses and facilities, in which other sports don't do that. So, for example, if you're watching Usain Bolt sprint in 2008 in the Beijing Olympics, you don't then go and want to get on a plane with a pair of running spikes and go and run in the stadium, or very few people do. You've got to be pretty nerdy to do that. However, if you watch the Ryder Cup, whether you're watching it in France or you're watching it in Italy, it's a direct picture postcard promotion of the facilities that country has to offer to golfers. As a result, over the short duration of the event, over 5-6 days, in France, at the Golf National, new golf course, and in Rome, at the Simeone course, they delivered 235 million of economic impact directly into those events, and 300 million in Rome. Taking it back to MENA, golf in Dubai. The Dubai Desert Classic was, I think, you may correct me, was one of the first major international sporting fixtures on the calendar in the MENA region. It started in 1989. It's been running continuously ever since. And Dubai's investment in the event has also allowed them to build a very strong relationship with the European Tour, which culminated in the Road to Dubai from 2009. Ultimately, it led to the European Tour's most significant sponsorship with DP World, which has renamed the European Tour as the DP World Tour. Alongside its hosting of these two events, each of which annually delivers tens of millions of economic impact into Dubai, it's also invested significantly in building championship quality courses. Some of you may have played them. Emirates Golf Course, Jumeirah, Dubai Creek, the Ells, etc. All of which, in turn, have been endorsed by the events that it hosts. It's a perfect virtuous circle. All of this investment and the positioning of Dubai as a golfing paradise with excellent connectivity by air, really good, favourable seasonality. When it's really stinky here, in terms of the weather, it's fantastic in Dubai, has meant that it's driven huge annual visitation from golfers who are a really good, lucrative spending demographic. 11 courses, 9 clubs, 410,000 rounds played annually, a spend on golf per annum of $270 million, and a golf tourism boon, GVA, of around 58 million a year. Moving on, destination place marketing. Sport has, for many years, been used highly effectively as one of the best means of nation brand building, destination place marketing. Sports event tourism, people who travel to spectate or play in sport, is one of the fastest growing sectors in world tourism. It currently generates around 10% of world expenditure on tourism at 559 billion in 2023. It's predicted to grow at a rate of 17.5% between now and 2030. The MENA region's success, particularly the GCC, in hosting some of the world's highest profile sports events in football, athletics, MMA, has announced the region's ambitions for rapid growth and postal diversification. Sport tourism has been called out specifically by His Highness Mohammed bin Salman as being key towards the kingdom's goals of 150 million tourists per annum by 2030. And significant strides have already been made with the global media successes of Riyadh Season, the Joshua fight, don't know if anyone saw it, and you can see the Riyadh Season branding on the mats, Formula One, Formula E, WWE, etc. Abu Dhabi was a really early adopter of destination place marketing and have combined team sponsorship, hence sponsoring the team, branding appears on the car and the boat, with WRC on the left and a deal we brokered to host the Volvo Ocean Race on the right. Both becoming a team sponsor and an official race partner, as any other brand would do, has extended the exposure of the destination across the 9 months of the event and in each of the markets the event visits. Abu Dhabi has since landed deals with US rights holders through the Department of Culture and Tourism, and combining with Abu Dhabi Sports Council, securing long-term rights to the UFC and NBA. Since 2009, Abu Dhabi has hosted F1, not the first in the region, that was Bahrain. In 2002, a couple of years ago, when we researched it, 70% of fans at Yas Marina Circuit were international fans. 85% polling is likely to want to visit again post-Formula One. 90% likely to recommend to a friend as a travel destination. And Abu Dhabi has secured the world-leading sport tourism destination accolade prize at the World Travel Awards in consecutive years since 2013. No small achievement. I want to move on to social impact of sports. TSC have developed market-leading methodology for the amplification and measurement of social return on investment. My contention is, if sport gets the calculation of social return on investment right in making its case to government, it doesn't need to do any more than this. This is so incredibly important and incredibly powerful. It provides a financial measure of the societal benefits of hosting major events. We examine the 5 areas you can see there: physical well-being, mental well-being, individual development, social community development, and economic development. How do we quantify that? We quantify the savings from reduced costs of healthcare, crime, social exclusion, and also the economic gain from increased productivity, civic inclusion, volunteering, and skilling. Of these, I just want to take one measure: the cost to government of physical inactivity. Inactivity is the 4th leading risk factor for all global deaths. It leads to increased chances of developing type 2 diabetes, heart disease, other related conditions. In Europe, middle of the chart, it's been estimated that inactivity imposes economic costs to the EU27 of over 80 billion euros a year, equivalent to 6.25% of all European health spending, or the annual GDP of either Ireland or Portugal. By 2030, the annual economic cost could rise to 250 billion. Costs which could be avoided if all Europeans were to achieve the WHO guidelines of 150 minutes of just moderate physical activity per week. We've worked extensively in the UK on the what we call SROI of sport. In the UK, 25% of adults are currently deemed to be inactive, with 11 million doing less than 30 minutes of total activity a week. And the government estimates that for every pound, missing a number, every pound spent on sport and physical activity generates £4 in return across health and well-being. Every year, active lifestyles prevent 900,000 cases of diabetes and 93,000 cases of dementia, which is a combined saving of 7 billion to the UK economy. Now, we don't have such accurate data for MENA, so I don't want to get into a naming and shaming, singling out sort of exercise. Safe to say that every government we deal with in the region recognises that levels of physical inactivity are not where they need to be, and there are significant risks and costs. Taking an average from our regional research, we estimate that physical inactivity is around 70 to 80% of the population across the GCC, which is a high number. And whilst we don't have consistent data, normally we draw from accelerometers, personal devices, phones, we can't draw firm conclusions. But if we extrapolate, as we have done for Europe on spending, that would put the public health costs of the MENA region at over 20 billion a year from physical inactivity. What's certainly true is that levels of participation are increasing. To use Saudi as an example, with historic low levels of sports participation, in 2019, 29% of the population was participating in sport. By 2022, that had risen to 49%, which is a 33% increase. And it's good progress toward hitting the ambitious 64% physical activity or sports participation by 2030. With healthcare costs estimated at 4 billion per annum from inactivity, I think that's well worth the investment. I'd like to conclude with what I think is possibly one of the most interesting and impactful areas for MENA from sport. With GCC countries driving for post-war diversification of their economies, has been an extraordinarily ambitious, again on the panel earlier, bold and highly innovative approach to investing in sport. It's not just as a way of driving a narrow economic return, but to do so while delivering on wider economic, social, cultural, and reputational benefits we've talked about earlier on in the presentation. Sport contributes 1.5 to 2% of global GDP. The target for Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia is 3% of GDP by 2030. Now, I've spent the last decade or more working with large private equity such as CVC and Silver Lake with their investments in sport. And I'd suggest that not only were the GCC investors amongst the earliest to recognise the growth potential of sport as an investment class, they've been the most innovative in their approach. Sorry, I have a visceral reaction when I see Man City again as an Arsenal fan was so close at the end of the season. Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan was amongst the first into the Premier League with his acquisition of Man City around $212 million in 2008. By most estimates, he's invested around 1.8 billion in the club since then, and the club is now valued at $5 billion as of the end of last year. That's pretty good CAGR, where I'm standing. 9 of the 20 clubs in football's rich list now have Middle Eastern sponsorship or investment, these 9 clubs. We won't do a quiz. Qatar's investment into US sports, with their acquisition of a small minority 5% share of Monumental Sports, which is the Washington-based franchises, marks another shrewd investment. We expect to see much more Middle East investment in US sports, particularly as the NFL, I expect, pretty well telegraphed, this year relaxes its rules on minority investment for the first time. Why is it smart? From 2012 to 2021, the average value of an NBA team increased by 387%, while the average value of an NHL team increased by 207%, significantly outpacing the growth of the S&P. I think that's by a factor of 2, actually, and there's very little volatility in that over the time. Saudi investment in Newcastle United is also looking particularly good business, with significant improvements in performance on the pitch and commercially for relatively modest investment, especially compared to Chelsea, who, by the way, are still behind Newcastle in the Premier League table, albeit coming back quickly. That said, with Saudi investment also in Clearlake, who own Chelsea, that's a win-win. This adds to Saudi's wider investments in football, with the Saudi Pro League closing on $1 billion, and investment in the football supply chain in Saudi and outside of Saudi, as Danny talked about earlier. It includes investment in stadia in Qiddiya, proposed, and wider infrastructure in the kingdom. Whilst investment in sport still represents less than 2% of Saudi's sovereign wealth, the investments have been really interesting. Saudi has a willingness to ask and answer the hard questions traditional sports have typically shied away from over decades, which have led to disruptive investments like LIV, which has famously brought really bold innovations to the sport of golf to keep the sport relevant to younger generations of fans. Anyone recognise what that is? Yeah, were you? Esports. I'm getting a bit old for it, to be honest. But recognising and making the point, the younger demographic in Saudi, 63% under the age of 30, which is still a mind-bending number and what makes Saudi so exciting. Saudi has, for example, invested really heavily in esports, with early investments in Activision Blizzard, now signed to Microsoft, EA, we saw the chart earlier, ticker, and Nintendo. And through Savvy Games Group and EFG, has plans to invest tens of billions of dollars into a Saudi esports hub, dedicated esports venues in Qiddiya, and hosting the Gamers 8 Festival this year with the largest prize money in gaming. Gaming is expected to contribute around $1 billion and 39,000 jobs by 2030. The Kingdom has also been investing not just in sponsorship and hosting, but in committing around those investments in a way, again, Danny talked about earlier. It wants to build the sports sector in Saudi. As well as hosting F1, Prince Khalid bin Sultan Al Faisal, president of the Saudi Motorsport Federation, has a stated desire to see manufacturing, training, and potentially even team bases in Saudi. The aim being to contribute from the investments in sponsorship and hosting toward economic diversification, skilling locally as they build a motorsport ecosystem and supply chain. And this sits alongside investments the PIF has already made, as many of you may know, in Aston Martin, it was McLaren, I think it exited, and infrastructure like the innovative Qiddiya F1 track with the famous blade. With regional companies such as Abu Dhabi's motorsport-focused G42 and Bahrain's Bell Racing, I think there's every reason to feel confident that it's going to create a flywheel effect for the GCC and high-performance motorsport. In conclusion, the MENA region is investing very significantly in sport, participation, narrow financial investments, and will continue to benefit from the full spectrum of benefits I've outlined. The region will host the world's largest events, including the AFC Asian Cup, FIFA World Cup in Morocco first in 2030, and Saudi in 2034. Multiple rounds of F1 across the region, and in US sports leagues like the NBA. The world's awareness of and perspective of the region is changing rapidly and positively as a result of its hosting, sponsorship, and investment in sport. Like other regions, levels of physical activity present a significant public policy challenge, and a culture of sports participation is hard to build. But the investment happening is both top-down, in terms of bringing events in to inspire participation, and bottom-up, in terms of building the systems required to encourage sports participation, elite athlete identification and development, and building world-class sports facilities. The region's investment in sport, particularly from sovereign wealth, has been world-leading, and whilst it will yield commercial returns, it's being deployed to amplify social, cultural, and economic returns to MENA countries in a way which I think is unique to the region. Thank you.